It's fantastic to be here. This is the 9th Annual Belarusian Conference, and I still remember the first one. And so being here as the speaker, there were already 3 other speakers in the room. So again, I feel pressure because I'm not certain my talk is going to be as good as those 3. 3 other people have also heard parts of this talk before, so I apologize. I'll try not to bore you too much. But without further ado, I also want to just quickly say I would love to put Belarus in my title at the University of Bath, but I was hired to teach Russia, and I managed to get the post-Soviet bit into my title. That was good enough. Maybe not, but that's where we are today, sadly. So, yes, what I'm going to talk about is the end of adaptive authoritarianism in Belarus, ? And this comes from, in part, the events that have happened after 2020 and the Belarusian protests. Because when I worked on my book, The Authoritarian International, that came out in May 2023, a lot of the work was before 2020. And I was talking about authoritarian learning and how Belarus was particularly key in regards to this. And further on, a recent article in European Studies looks at whether it's the end of adaptation. Now, in terms of authoritarian learning, when I put this into authoritarian learning into DALI, this is what it churned out after a couple of goes. And I think it represents what I mean by authoritarian learning particularly well. For me, regimes learn because they must survive. Most autocrats want to end up like Francisco Franco, dying at a ripe old age in 1975 in their bed, or like Antonio Salazar in Portugal, where they spend the last 10 years of their life because they have Alzheimer's, just scribbling pieces of legislation that ends up in the bin, and they get the same pieces of legislation the next day, and they carry on until they pass. That's what autocrats would like to have happen. But that doesn't happen very often. Most autocrats end up like Gaddafi in Libya, dragged through the streets of Misrata and beaten to death with lead piping by their people. And so what I argue about authoritarian learning is that they are learning, cooperating together to consolidate their own power and develop best survival practices. And so I think this picture best represents what I mean, because it's about survival practices. It is generally the Interior Ministry, the security services, the Security Council who are engaging in this development of best survival practices. We can also see that the security official has a book for a head, and the pages of the book are turning. Ergo, they are reading the book, they are learning, they're trying to see what the book can tell them about the development of survival practices. And in the background, you may see the surveillance camera as well on an iPhone or Samsung. And again, this highlights what I mean by authoritarian learning. I think it's a good representation to have. In regards to the book, the title is not something about an ideology. When I presented the book at a university up north, we had a long, heated discussion about the idea of an authoritarian international, similar to the communist international, that it was about ideology, the spreading of authoritarianism. What I would argue, and do argue, is authoritarianism is more of an authoritarian isn't. It isn't about the spread of values. But the title is a homage to the great late Belarusian political scientist Vitaly Silitsky, who started to talk about the authoritarian international principally between Belarus and Russia in the mid-2000s. The idea that these two regimes were working together to counter the colour revolutions and to enhance their survival practices. And as Vitaly developed the concept, he also included other autocracies, Venezuela, Iran, and others as well. And so the title of the book is an homage to his work, because without him and Tom Ambrosio at North Dakota State University and Andrew Wilson, this book would not have appeared, would not have come out because of the work they were already doing on the subject. So without further ado, what I would find in the book, what I try to do is look at the how, the when, the why, and the what, as we all do. Looking at how they learn, when they learn, what they learn, and why they learn. And as I say, they learn because they want to enhance their survival. Looking at the nuances, I can explain more if it comes up in Q&A later. But that were the questions I wanted to address. What I would argue is, as I say, authoritarian regimes, autocracies are constantly adapting. They must get it right every single time, whereas protesters only need to get it right once. That doesn't mean they don't make mistakes. They do, quite often. But generally, for consolidated autocracies, it is survivable for those mistakes. But the point is that they are constantly having to adapt, and it is all about close cooperation and collaboration. In the post-Soviet region, and the 4 case studies I look at are 2 established autocracies, Belarus and Russia, and 2 regimes that have authoritarian-minded elites within them, Moldova and Ukraine. So I admit that this may just be a post-Soviet phenomenon, and I am working on an article about this, but post-Soviet regional organizations are key to learning. They act as learning rooms. The chance for regular meetings between autocrats and between personnel within the authoritarian regimes allows them to develop and share best practices, to find out what is happening in Azerbaijan, what is happening in Uzbekistan, and see if it can be implemented in Minsk or Astana. And regional organizations are also important because they allow for training exercises to happen. So for instance, 2 examples I can give you: documents from the CIS of the Security Council Ministry meetings that are formal, so we do have a record of them. They talk a lot in the mid-2000s about dealing with youth groups, bringing young people back on to supporting the regime to counter the colour revolutions. Interestingly, at the first meeting of the presidents of the CIS in 2015, we start hearing about fascists, dealing with fascist Democrats who are trying to forge protests in the post-Soviet space, just after the Euromaidan. And in regards to the CSTO, the Common Collective Security Treaty Organization, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they're engaged in anti-terrorist activities and training exercises. And what we can see in terms of the Brotherhood training exercises of 2011, 2013, 2015 in the CSTO is that they are dealing with the type of terrorists who take to the streets and wave banners and shout slogans. To you and I, they're protesters. But it's a way for them to cover themselves in some legitimacy by calling it an anti-terrorist operation or exercise. In terms, again, linked to the post-Soviet space, the networks of learning are crucial, and they go deep. If I could get more research funding, hopefully one day, I will look at the depth of those networks. What I was able to find looking at the presidents, the prime ministers, the parliaments, the security councils, the presidential administrations, the interior ministries, the foreign affairs ministries, and the Ministry of Defense is that these networks go down to the level of first deputy. So at least a 3rd level. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to find more detail, and it isn't just within the post-Soviet space. There are examples, Viktor Shaiman, for instance, the former head of the Belarusian presidential administration, going to China to talk to members of the Chinese Communist Party and the people who created the Great Firewall of China to see whether Belarus could implement anything from the Chinese scenario. Belarus does not have the resources a la China, and also China started much earlier. But what we see is that when Shaiman came back 3 weeks later, internet cafes, people going into internet cafes had to give their passport or a copy of their passport. They also had to save their browser history so the KGB could get access to it if necessary. We also see in terms of the Arab Spring, Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the Russian Security Council, going to members in North Africa and the Middle East to find out how they survived the Arab protests or how they failed. What led to the failure or success in places like Morocco, Algeria, and also Egypt. What I also argue in the book is learning from success and internal learning are crucial. They're much harder to see though. We know when an autocracy fails, it tends to fail spectacularly. Gaddafi is always the prime example of that. But autocrats do learn from success. They just don't like talking about it. And one example is the foreign agents law in Russia. Passed in 2012 in Russia, it's then passed in Uzbekistan in 2013, 2014 Kazakhstan, 2015 Kyrgyzstan, 2016 Uzbekistan, 2017 I believe it goes to Azerbaijan, it goes back. And then in 2018 it goes to China, 2019 on to Iran, and it continues in terms of iterations. In terms of legislation, they're also particularly key in terms of copying each other. Successful legislation, how to deal with foreign funding for the media. For instance, Edward Lemon and Oleg Antonov have recently written a working paper on the legislation in the post-Soviet space, putting it through plagiarism software. And for one example, they found that foreign funding for media between the Kyrgyz and Azeri governments was word for word the same, from the Azerbaijani to the Kyrgyz. The Kyrgyz didn't even change the name of the Azeri interior minister in the legislation. They just copied it word for word. So it is learning because it was successful and those sorts of things. And also internal learning is important, at least in authoritarian-minded elites. So places like Moldova and Ukraine, because they have moved from one regime to another. Petro Poroshenko, commonly referred to as the bellwether of Ukrainian politics, being part of the Kushma regime, then the Yushchenko regime, then the Yanukovych regime, and then he became president in 2014 and took ideas from everyone in order to make sure that he could build up the capacity for his family, which isn't just blood ties. And the same is also true to a lesser extent of Moldova as well. The Hotnyuk, the purse of Vladimir Voronin in 2000, took a lot of ideas from Voronin when he had a revelatory moment and suddenly realized he wasn't a communist and was a Democrat, and so started funding the Democratic Party of Moldova and was behind the scenes as the Grey Cardinal of Moldovan politics until about 2019. Finally, on this, learning from democracies is crucial. What I would argue is that these regimes are adapting to learning from democracies, but also what they perceive democracies to be doing. And I'll use Russia as an example here. Sergei Kiriyenko, the head of the domestic section of the presidential administration in Russia, has openly said that he liked how Trump used Twitter, or X as it's called today, that Trump had managed to engage people who normally don't go out and vote through social media and younger people. And Kiriyenko felt that younger Russians weren't supporting the Kremlin, that unfortunately, Putin may or may not be able to turn a computer on. We still don't know. He certainly doesn't use Twitter, and that someone in the regime needed to engage younger people. And we do see the use of social media, the use of TikTok increasingly in the regime. And to a lesser extent, Belarus has also turned to using Telegram as well. And they also learn from what they perceive democracies to be doing, I argue. And this comes from another article on Russia's second preventative counter-revolution, the idea that the West is engaged in external efforts at democratization, as the colour revolutions in the 2000s, and again in 2011, 2012, the Arab Spring, which Putin famously said was just a precursor to a Russian Spring, the collapse of the Russian regime. It was a warm-up, and so they needed to adapt. And I argue that they engage in external efforts at democratization in reverse, if you want to call it that, funding opposition politicians and alternative media to try and change voters' perceptions. Now, in terms of the theory, I'm going to talk about the theory of authoritarian learning briefly. I promise not to bore you too much. It's only one slide, I promise. So, and then I'm going to talk about the theory of adaptive authoritarianism taken from Matthew Freer's excellent book in 2019, The Lukashenko Regime. So, what generally was perceived in terms of authoritarian learning was this, at least when I began the PhD back in 2015, state A does something, states B, C, and D do the same thing 6 months later, ergo, learning has occurred. There was no limited analysis of what that actually entailed, how they went about it, why they went about it, and when they went about it. There was also the assumption that some autocracies were models for others. Russia, China, Singapore, Venezuela, Cuba, plausibly as well, and that they were, like in a lecture hall, standing in front of the other autocrat students who hopefully were listening word for what Putin was saying about how to deal with civil society and taking notes, and then they go back to Minsk and Astana and implement what Putin had said. That's how it was envisaged in terms of all roads leading to Moscow. What I argue in the book is that this isn't the case. It's far more horizontal than this idea of verticality. It's more like a group of mad scientists sitting around at a workshop discussing what they've been doing for the past year and finding out what went well in Astana, what failed in Tashkent, and various other aspects as well. And Russia is willing to learn. Although it would never admit it, it is willing to learn from other autocracies if they get it right. And I've argued in an article in 2017 that Russia took a lot from Belarus in terms of its first counter-revolution in the mid-2000s against the Orange Revolution. Now, in terms of the argument on adaptive authoritarianism, Matthew argues that the Belarusian regime is an adaptive authoritarian regime, an adaptive autocracy. And I would argue, at least I did in the book and in the paper in 2017, that this is indeed true, that Belarus provides an awful lot of lessons for other autocracies in the post-Soviet space, at least, to take ideas from. So, Matthew argues that there are a number of reasons why this regime is an adaptive autocracy. It's down to personist rule. Belarus, as we know, is a personist dictatorship. And whilst, of course, it's never just one man ruling the state, it is, in terms of Lukashenko being the personification of the regime, and what he says effectively goes to a great extent, and therefore he can adapt whenever he deems it necessary. There is less of an ideology in terms of the Belarusian regime, although that may be changing in terms of what seems to be occurring in 2022 to today in terms of the historical mythologization of Belarus and Russia. There's also neo-patrimonialism, as Freer would argue, that Lukashenko ostensibly can move people around. He can bring them in, he can move them around, and therefore the regime is adaptable because they try to do what he or what they think he wants. It's similar to Russia in many respects. They can be moved out if they don't do the same thing, and if they also try to take too much power, they can be pushed aside relatively easily. And so the regime is adaptive in terms of that. The next argument is performance legitimacy. That the regime bears some legitimacy by guaranteeing people jobs, guaranteeing healthcare, guaranteeing other things. People may not necessarily be rich, but they are guaranteed a job, they are guaranteed healthcare, and the regime is able to gain legitimacy from this. This is the argument put forward. There is also, whether we like it or not, Freer would argue, managed pluralism. Yes, there is, of course, a systemic opposition. There is very limited non-systemic opposition allowed in Belarus, but the Belarusian regime does allow some form of elections in terms of some competition, limited as it may be, and in terms generally of the presidential candidates, whilst 3 of the presidential candidates are known, Lukashenko and 2 others in the systemic opposition. Historically, there was always a 4th candidate that no one, at least for a while, was overly certain who they were, and therefore they may be oppositional, or, well, maybe not oppositional, but at least they may be relatively outside the control of Lukashenko. And of course, as we all know, the coercive capacity, the ability for the regime to ratchet up repression when necessary and to lower it when necessary as well. Adaptation, sorry. Okay. So this is what I mean, this is what Freire argues is adaptive authoritarianism. Now, what I would argue, and what I argue in the article in European Studies, is that, to use the phrase, the ivory tower, that this is where the Lukashenko regime has got to in terms of one of the biggest problems for any autocrat is having stayed in power for too long. The information bubble that grows around the autocrat. Whilst there were, of course, protests in 2020, we all know that, there were protests in 2017 and a few others as well, protests overall were limited from 2010 until 2020. And as Andrew has argued, the regime simply got lazy. That there was now a need, there was no need to have to deal with mass protests in terms of exercises. And as members of the Belarusian regime did record, they knew the techniques to deal with protesters anyway, so there was no need to change the situation. I would also argue, particularly since 2017, the growth of civil society outside of politics, dealing with, well, civil society sort of initiatives and bringing people together, which is one of the biggest problems for any autocrat. You don't want your people to actually start thinking for themselves and uniting. And what we saw, particularly after 2017 with the social parasite law, was that civil society organizations were starting to become important, or at least weren't being as restricted as in the past. And this, in part, comes down to the soft Belarusianization of 2014, especially that Lukashenko needed to balance away from Russia. He needed to show to a Western audience that Belarus, or rather Minsk, was not in Russia, as friends famously told us it was. And so that there was a need to show that Belarus was a distinct state, and also to highlight to Belarusians, if necessary, that Belarus had a culture, had an identity, and it was now going to be applauded. Well, not applauded, but at least allowed to happen. And we do see references to the Belarusian People's Republic as well. We do see other references to Belarus as distinct from Lukashenko's version of what Belarus was like beforehand, in terms of only having a history from the Great Patriotic War, ultimately. We do also see the growing emergence of the private sector. And I think this comes down to the ivory tower situation. Lukashenko, in part, limited protests, lazy, possibly, if you want to call it that, and not understanding that society, to an extent at least, has changed. That there is this growth of civil society, there is also this growth of identity, and for younger people, especially, the private sector is a major employer. And I think Lukashenko didn't see the change in terms of Belarusian society in regards to that, and still believed, as some interlocutors told me during the research for the book, that Belarus remained as it had been in the early 2000s. He hadn't seen the development of Belarus away from what he perceived it to be. And also we see that the perception of what the social contract in Belarus should be also changed amongst younger Belarusians as well, that they wanted less state involvement in the social contract. Perhaps most importantly, and I think this comes down to what I argue in the article, is the regime effectively blinding itself with the closing of the Information Analytical Centre. I remember speaking to one interviewee who I can't mention where they were from in the States, but off the record over a couple of beers said, this is absolutely crazy as to why the IAC was closed down. It seems to have disappeared around about 2015. What the IAC was, or from what my understanding of it, and someone please tell me if I'm wrong in the Q&A, was that the IAC would poll Belarusians to find out what could lead to protests, what legislation, if it was implemented, would lead to protests as well. And as the person said, in terms of the social parasite law, the very idea that the only way to save the economy was to tax the unemployed students and pensioners was absolutely crazy. And if they had put it through the IAC, they would have known this would have led to protests, as it did in 2017. And therefore, what I argue in the book is one of the key issues, having seen what happened in the Arab Spring, where social media led to mass protests, plausibly in 2009 in Moldova, the Twitter revolution, as it was called, and definitely in 2013, 2014, when, as we all know, or the assumption always is, that the Euromaidan started with a single Facebook post, that social media was becoming increasingly key, and the regime had to adapt to that analysis. And with only the limited resources brought on by 3 economic recessions in the decade, the Belarusian regime moved its resources away from the IAC towards social media, which hasn't necessarily worked out particularly well for the regime, but it also, as I argue in the article, blinded the regime because it took away one of the most important tools of how the regime understood society. So, in terms of the end of adaptive authoritarianism in Belarus, as mentioned, the framework put forward by Matthew is personalist rule, neo-patrimonialism, performance legitimacy, managed pluralism, and coercive capacity. What I say in the article is, of course, the personalist rule is still there. Lukashenko hasn't, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, disappeared. And so the regime is still there. It's still a personalist dictatorship. Neo-patrimonialism, to a great extent, is still there. He's still able to move elites around when necessary. There have been some defections, of course, in BIPOL and amongst some ambassadors. I think the ambassador for Argentina is one of the few who actually defected. But overall, the regime has remained fairly homogenous, although it isn't bringing in new people. One of the key aspects of autocratic stability, as Johannes Grzybski would argue, is cooptation of new elites, new blood, as it were, in order to bring in new ideas to help regime survival. And what I would argue is this isn't happening in Belarus. Yes, people are being brought in. Yes, there are young people going into the regime, but ultimately they have the same ideas as to what has existed in the past. And this is a problem. In terms of the performance legitimacy, certainly Lukashenko is, I would argue, illegitimate to a majority of Belarusians. As we saw, obviously, with the protests in 2020 and his unofficial, real electoral tally, he is illegitimate, although plausibly a third of Belarusians would still support Lukashenko. That's probably not that high as it was. Well, certainly it's not a third anymore. I think increasingly what we're seeing is the regime is very much hunkering down. It is, without the legitimacy, relying on the other pillar of autocratic stability. And Gashevsky always argued in his article in 2013 that the three pillars were equal, but one pillar was slightly more equal than all the others. And that actually the plinth on which the stability rested was resting on repression. That a regime can survive for a long time on repression alone. Autocrats can, if they maintain that coercive capacity, maintain their own power. It becomes increasingly hard, but ultimately, because, and I could be wrong on this, and I'm sure others will bring me up on it, there hasn't been too many defections. Ultimately, those in the regime are still willing to support Lukashenko because they know that if Lukashenko goes, they go with him. It is one of the arguments put forward by people like Bruce Bernardo Mesquita, Alistair Smith as well. The key part of any autocratic survival is the winning coalition. And elites want to make sure they're still winning. And if Lukashenko is how they win, they will keep him there. In terms of the managed pluralism, that, as we know, has gone particularly recently, and I'll come to that in a moment. But as I mentioned, the coercive capacity is key. The regime is reliant increasingly, and some would argue certainly the regime has always relied on repression, and learning never really happened. I remember being in Minsk and being told repeatedly that learning doesn't exist. The regime simply uses the resources it had since the 1990s, and now it's all dried up. But the regime is reliant on repression increasingly. So, in terms of the end, as David argued, I think it was during the pandemic at this Belarusian conference online, that Lukashenko has ultimately burnt his bridges, that there's limited room for maneuver, that he is to a great extent beholden to this gentleman here and the survival of Vladimir Putin, that the adaptation is increasingly threadbare within the regime. There's certainly been increased copying of Russia in terms of, I can't read that, sorry, bear with me, the screen sharing thing has gone across this bit. So in terms of the growing enhancement of a patriotic education, in terms of the historical mythology of Belarus, and I know that in the past that has also been there, the idea that Minsk was the fourth Rome, and that the third Rome, Moscow, which somehow collapsed without actually collapsing, but Minsk was the fourth Rome. That disappeared very quickly. But it's, in terms of historical mythology, the Great Patriotic War, ties to Russia, Slavic Union, they are all coming back. And we also see a constitutional referendum in 2022, mirroring in part the Russian constitutional referendum of 2020 and the legislation that a marriage is between a man and a wife. This is stop now. I do apologize. But there has been some adaptation-ish in a very limited way, ultimately, because Lukashenko is tied in to the survival of Putin. If Putin loses the war in Ukraine, this will be a game changer for Lukashenko's survival, I would argue, and I think many would, but there has been an attempt at adaptation. The constitutional referendum itself was an adaptation in terms of taking it further than what happened in Russia. The simple fact that more power was given to the All-Belarusian People's Assembly, and from my understanding, more power was also given to the Prime Minister as well, as an attempt for Lukashenko to see, I doubt he's going to become the Prime Minister, but he may move into the All-Belarusian People's Assembly. This is his Nazarbayev moment. Nazarbayev tried to give more power to the Security Council and it failed. Lukashenko is trying to find a new way round that issue and to weaken the powers of the presidency. There has been the continual locating of allies, and this has also been a key part of Belarus's foreign policy for many a year in terms of, yes, Russia, rightly or wrongly, is the closest pole within the free-winged foreign policy of Belarus, but Belarus has tried to find others to limit its dependence on Russia. China, of course, is key. Lukashenko, I believe, was in Zimbabwe in 2022 doing something with tractors. And there was also various other moves, I believe, to South Sudan. I think he met Salva Kiir, the president of South Sudan. He was in 2023, the United Arab Emirates and Kenya, as well as China, trying to do or support the Belarusian economy, link it as much as he could away from Russia, trying to find greater unity between, also trying to link away from Russia in terms of foreign policy and trying to get an alternative from that. How effective that has been at the moment seems to be minimal, but the point is they have tried to adapt. And of course, perhaps another key aspect is the one-day voting. Linked, and this is definitely, I would argue, adaptation. Knowing that people may protest if you have more than one electoral day, you move it to 1 day. So you have the parliamentary and local elections on the same day in 2024 for the first time. And this limits the amount of capacity that people have to go and protest as well. Now, what I would argue, and I'll sum up here, is that measuring learning adaptation takes a long time. In terms of looking at autocracies, getting inside the black box takes a long time. Being able to gather sufficient evidence to make conclusions, whether those conclusions are right or wrong, that's for the reader to interpret, but to be able to make conclusions takes a long time, at least a year. So I would argue that yes, there is still some adaptation within the Belarusian regime, and this would be interesting to hear your thoughts, hear your ideas as to how to take this potential idea further. Having argued that plausibly in 2023 we were seeing the end of adaptive authoritarianism in Russia, also in Belarus, Russia as well for that matter, but I would argue that whilst there is still leeway for Lukashenko and there is still attempts by people within the regime to be able to learn, to adapt, and to try to develop best survival practices in a very difficult environment for Lukashenko. But, as I argue, repression is now the dominant practice. This is something that I think we can all agree that the Belarusian regime is going to be increasingly reliant on. Most autocrats don't decide, as Daniel Treisman has argued, in terms of democratization of autocracies. Most autocrats don't wake up one morning and go, you know what, guys, let's open up the media to free voice. Let's hold free and fair elections because I think I can win those. Generally, the autocrat relies on repression to stay in power and coercion and maintaining the economic support base in terms of making sure the elites that exist still have access to those resources. We're seeing this in regards to Russia as well, with Western companies having pulled out of Russia. One of the first things Putin did was to give most of those economic resources to those around him. And that is one way I think he's tried to maintain the winning coalition within Russia. So thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute honor. And thank you to Yarik, Andrew, and of course, Peter for doing this for so many years. I think it's important that we have a Belarusian conference every year. I think it's important that UCL, especially, being obviously my alma mater, is the one that leads it. But more importantly, I think it's important that we need to talk about Belarus And maybe in the next staff meeting, when I go and see my head of department, I can ask whether I can include Belarus and Ukraine in my official title. We'll see what happens on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'm sure there will be questions, and we also welcome comments from the floor, not just questions. And I had a thought, whether there is a theory which someone has already explored, that Lukashenko essentially has exhausted its domestic legitimacy. He saw in 2020 that there was no one who would come out voluntarily to support him, or almost no one, right? There were hundreds of thousands against him, and he barely could manage to gather, a couple of thousand. And then he said, okay, I can't do it. I'll just give up and I will rely completely on Russia. And maybe Russia is now in the same process, but it says, okay, I'm giving up. I'm going to rely on China. So that's the authoritarian. They learn from each other, but they also lean on each other. And so at some point when one feels that, okay, I have no domestic legitimacy, I just give up. And also, I think for many protesters in 2020, there was an important consideration that, okay, what happens next if we overthrow Lukashenko? And to me, the obvious answer was that Russia would step in with its army. Found later that it was going to attack Ukraine again, but it would have no hesitation to remove whatever regime would replace Lukashenko if it's less pro-Russian or more pro-democracy. So that's one comment. I'm not going to ask you to answer it now. Let's pick up a few more comments from the floor, and then we'll pass it over to you. So introduce yourself, please.
Wojciech Hustak, Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences. Thank you very much for inspiring lecture. And I have asked about management pluralism and balancing of Russia. And what do you think about Belarus and its project Belarus? Yes, as it's part of Russian influence or not? And second issue, Belarusian regime and new tendencies about the global south you talk, and maybe it is a part of why then situation, because we have in my of course new Cold War and two blocks, yes, yes, authoritarian and democracies, and if you see war in Ukraine, we can see global south is for Russia, yes, as maybe it is. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll pick one more question, and then we'll over to you.
Okay. Peter Braga, associate lecturer, politics at UCL. Now, this is kind of like a comment, but then also I'm sort of bringing up for wider discussion. When you had that excellent little bit at the end of your lecture slides with the various possible, current adaptations, I was also sort of wondering, as an extra one might be sort of building on Russia's failures, right? Because we had that article that came out in Foreign Affairs written by Artem Shreibman, right? And where he basically contends that Lukashenko, the one person to benefit from this terrible war is basically Lukashenko, because he now has a use to hang around, right? And we also, luckily tonight, also have last year's keynote speaker, Paul Hansberry here as well, who was also discussing on, so what options are there for Belarus? And again, it seems that what Artem Shreibman was saying is that at least for Lukashenko, he's managed to sort of, with this Prigozhin mutiny, then find a role for himself. So as Russia makes a mess, it gives extra adaptation space for him. So in some, to hang around. right? He has a use and won't be replaced. So I was wondering if you could either comment on this, and if Paul, if you wanted to chime in with anything. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate that we are nearing the end of time. So maybe we can have a final comment or a question from the floor, and then it will be over to Stephen.
My question was much more specific.
Okay.
Could you expand on your thoughts about voting? So on length, Belarus and Russia have gone in opposite directions. So Belarus has shortened the period, Russia has lengthened it. Although at the same time, Russia has copied Belarusian tactics about early voting. So what do you think about the various trends there?
And probably I would think that if there is more electoral activity on one day, then potentially there could be more sort of anger and people could mobilize themselves quicker. I don't know, but that's not a question, just a comment. Yeah. So the last round of comments from the keynote speaker, and it will be our reception. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll try to do this fairly quickly because I know everyone would want to go to the reception. So in terms of Lukashenko and the bolstering of autocrats, what I would argue, as Tom Ambrosio has done, that yes, autocracies do bolster one another. I would disagree with the idea of authoritarian promotion. I realize that's hard for some people to hear. When I talked about it at Stockholm, it led to a very long debate about autocratic promotion. What I would argue is that autocracies bolster one another when they're in times of crisis because they don't want autocratic failure, because it can be bad for the neighborhood. So Belarus will rely on Russia. Russia plausibly is relying on China, although whether Russia is that willing to rely on China, I don't know. I think that comes in with, it is increasingly a closer relationship, but I think that Russia is trying to hold off over-reliance on China to a great extent, but it is certainly there in times of crisis. In terms of, I didn't quite catch the last point you made, Yarik, about the Belarusian opposition. It seemed to be what to do with the Belarusian opposition, or maybe I was wrong.
I can't remember.
Okay, right. Good. What I would say is currently I'm working as an associate fellow for the Henry Jackson Society, looking at a democratic future for Russia, big question mark, bold, underline, the usual sorts of things. And looking at the Belarusian opposition as a key example of what they've been doing because they're so far ahead in terms of what Zhirinovskaya and various other people within the Belarusian opposition have been doing as a potential for what the Russian opposition should be doing. That, I think, is fascinating. I'm sure Paul could mention a lot more than I can about that. In terms of Belarus and Russian influence, I'm not going to lie, I don't know if it has Russian influence. I need to look into that. I think it's certainly interesting that Belarus seems to have become a political party, and that, yes, of course, the Kremlin is looking for influence over Lukashenko whenever, because whilst they know that Lukashenko being in power benefits them in the here and now, they have consistently tried to find an alternative, because he's always been too independent for Putin. So that may be something they're looking at in the future. In terms of the Global South supporting Russia, I'm still wary of saying the Global South supports Russia. I think we do see certainly that the Global South doesn't really care, and it sees the West as cynical for what it's been doing in terms of regime change and democratization. But I don't think the Global South supports Russia that much. I think for me, and less so Belarus, no one, very, very few countries that are willing to take on the Belarusian economic model. So I think for Lukashenko, he's simply looking for alternatives, and at least be able to show his people that he isn't completely beholden to Russia. I mean, in terms of a great economic cooperation between Belarus and Kenya, Belarus and Zimbabwe, I don't know an awful lot about the Zimbabwean economy. I'm not certain what it can provide Belarus and vice versa, but it at least looks good in the media. So what I would argue about Scheidman, Peter, could you reiterate
Yeah, so I was just saying that building on
Yes.
Kryvoj's argument, that kind of adaptation, is that Lukashenko has basically, because of Russia's screwing up in Ukraine, has now given sort of an extra reason for Lukashenko to stick around, right? That now, instead of just being kind of useless, you know, he's lost all legitimacy. What does he do now? Oh, he can negotiate with Prigozhin. He can take on Wagner troops for some time and, you know, do some training there. He's now, you know, a base for missiles and things. So he's sort of this big benefit, or one of the benefits from the war has been for Lukashenko, right?
But is that legitimacy? What legitimacy are we talking about in terms of the support from Putin? I mean, legitimacy from Putin to Lukashenko, legitimacy for survival from the Belarusian population by taking missiles on. Is that what we're trying to?
Well, again, adaptive. I guess I'm not thinking of it in terms of adaptive authoritarianism, but as in like that. Basically, I'm saying, do you think the war has basically created space for Lukashenko to survive and also then to become more adaptive, find new spaces?
Potentially, yes, but certainly I would say that it's helped him survive the here and now, because Ukraine, as Putin, I think, was definitely hoping, didn't collapse in a week or so. That Viktor Yanukovych, who spent a glorious afternoon flying around southern Belarus, didn't make it to Kiev in terms of the regime change. So Lukashenko is useful because he is still the only Russian ally in Western post-Soviet space, I would argue. So yes, his survival is assured. I can imagine that Lukashenko, being the person he is, when this war is over, will, if the regime doesn't collapse immediately, and it may well do, will try and sell the West with the idea that yes, he was forced to bring in Russian missiles because of the pressure economically. Yes, he was forced in terms of Russian soldiers going across the border, but Belarusian soldiers didn't. And there are two things. He didn't technically get involved in the war. That's a lie. But more importantly, if Russia loses the war, it will likely lead to the collapse of the Putin regime. And it will likely lead to instability in Russia, plausibly. So he can tell the West, the EU, do you want two unstable neighbors on your border? You may as well, you may not like me, I may not like you, but that's realism. And therefore, if I go, you will have instability on a wide scale on your borders. That may be something he will try and sell the West. Whether the West will buy it, I really hope not. But the West has bought other things before. So yes, we'll see what happens in terms of that. And Andrew, I think it's certainly fascinating in terms of the difference in terms of elections that Belarus has gone to one day. Russia had the 3 days since the 2020 constitutional referendum, which Yela Pamfilova has now proclaimed as a tradition, and therefore Russian elections will continue in that guise. That you do have early voting, which Russia took from Belarus. And also, if we are to believe the press that's come out, I think yesterday, that Russia is talking about copying Belarus, that Russians living abroad won't be able to get passports renewed in their embassies, which is similar to obviously what happened in Belarus. So, as I say, Russia has learned a lot and continues to learn a lot from Belarus. Whether a one-day voting period is better than a 3-day voting period, I can't tell you. I don't know whether, as Yarik argued, it would lead to more protests. I think the Belarusian regime historically has been very good at not proclaiming or advertising parliamentary elections and local elections. And therefore, most Belarusians don't actually know they're happening. That generally stops the protests. And one day, it's hard to mobilize for a single day. You could plausibly argue it's easier to mobilize for 3 days because, going back to Yela Pamfilova, Russia is more democratic than countries in the West. In Britain, and I'm sure elsewhere, we only have a 1-day voting period. And people don't always get the chance to vote because you go to work, you come back, you're tired. The last thing you want to do is go and write an X on a piece of paper in a polling station. And Russia, by allowing people to vote in their houses, on tree stumps, at car boot, at the back of cars, is somehow more democratic because of this. But of course, it could also lead to bigger protests because you see more people on the streets and you start to see possibly, as we saw when Boris Nadezhdin just about, well, he didn't, but managed to get some support in terms of his candidacy, Russians may also see that they're not alone. They may start talking to each other. That could be dangerous over 3 days. I don't know. It's certainly an interesting thought experiment and would be interesting to ascertain if that's the case, which one works better and is more effective for autocratic survival.